Welcome, welcome, one and all, to Books I Will Never Read Again.
Uh-huh.
The only deep dive on this miserable planet dedicated to saving you time, sanity, and the very real risk of fracturing your skull trying to decipher pure, high-minded, impenetrable nonsense. I'm your guide, Uncle Bob, and today
Oh, boy.
we are strapping on the waders and descending into the deepest, darkest trenches of philosophical sewage.
And I'm here to, I guess, maintain regulatory compliance.
Good luck with that.
Making sure we emerge with our core intellectual structure, mostly intact. Today's target is Nick Land's highly controversial 1992 academic missile, The Thirst for Annihilation, Georges Bataille and Virulent.
Controversial is a very generous word for a book that reads like a dissertation written by a caffeine-addled teenager. One who's trying to win a goth poetry contest while simultaneously and very obviously failing out of philosophy school. Just the physical presentation alone gives you the chills. Simultaneously published in the USA and Canada by Routledge. That sounds less like a groundbreaking work of radical thought and more like, I don't know, the itinerary for a poorly planned mandatory corporate retreat.
Well, Land's book is intended to be a non-compliant, a non-academic study of Georges Bataille, the French theorist known for his obsessions with transgressions, sacrifice, eroticism, and the general economy. Land starts by preemptively refusing the standard academic treatment, the sound book that would just calmly explicate Bataille's ideas.
And he immediately tries to turn his own lack of sleep and, let's be honest, clear-headedness into some kind of intellectual virtue. Listen to the melodrama Land leads with. He suggests that to accept Bataille's writings is an impossibility, and yet to resist them is an irrelevance. He wraps this all up by suggesting we are all embarked on a lethargic suicide. What kind of existential doom-monger starts his thesis by announcing he's already lost?
Well, Land is deliberately aligning his methodology with Bataille's core philosophy. If Bataille's thought is truly about ruin and dissolution, then writing a balanced scholarly interpretation, a sound book, would, in Land's view, be a philosophical betrayal. It would be a schlecht book, a bad book. He requires the abnormal, the nauseating, the kind of intellectual rupture that happens only when the mind is operating outside of its polite daylight functions.
Yeah, that's where we get the classic opening scene, and I can just hear the dramatic music swelling now.
Yeah.
It is 03:30 in the morning. Let us say one is drunk, an impoverished cipher for all those terrible things one does to one's nervous system in the depths of the night, and philosophy is impossible.
Although one still thinks, even to the point of terror and disgust,
Right.
it's Land contextualizing the text as a product of intentional delirium. He's claiming that the only authentic philosophical engagement with Bataille has to happen at the moment of ego dissolution, when rational thought is impossible, but these terrifying realizations persist.
Exactly. So was this author just a dingbat who started writing this at 3:30 in the morning while drunk, convinced he was transcending all human reason? Yes. The answer is an enthusiastic, screaming, definite yes. Our mission today, however, is to cut through this dense, self-serious prose and distill the core, ridiculous arguments.
The general economy, the atheology, the libidinal materialism.
Right, all of it. So you, the listener, can know exactly why this material exists, why Land wrote it, and why it is universally and just spectacularly unreadable. We were providing the shortcut through this intellectual horror show. Let's start with the absolute foundation of Bataille's glorious, filthy worldview.
The poetry of waste.
The poetry of waste. I love it already.
Our foundation begins, surprisingly, with a poem called Rear, which translates quite simply to laughter. Land zeroes in on this 1928 text because it introduces and sort of welds together the three crucial themes that will define the rest of Bataille's thought.
As are.
Laughter, excrement, and death.
Delightful. Just delightful. Like stepping barefoot onto a wet floor covered in hair and realizing you just stood on a decomposing banana peel. And he gives us the key manifesto line, and I quote, "Laugh and laugh at the sun, at the nettles, at the stones, at the ducks, at the rain, at the pee-pee of the Pope, at mummy, at a coffin full of shit."
The intention of that quote, according to the analysis, is to establish communication through non-discursive means. Laughter is the vehicle for expressing the intolerable truth of death and the abject status of the human body.
The intolerable truth is that Bataille was a crusty bozo trying desperately to intellectualize something that's just fundamentally gross. Pee of the Pope, a coffin full of shit. This isn't a poem. This is the desperate, flailing manifesto of a piss clown trying to shock his equally bored literary friends in 1928 Paris. It's transgression for transgression's sake, dressed up in a little black beret.
Yet Land takes this imagery and he elevates it into a sophisticated mechanism of atheological philosophy. The academic interpretation is that the decomposed body is inherently excremental. When a biological individual dies, their body dissolves into noxious base matter analogous to excrement.
Wait, hold on. Break down the actual mechanism here for me. How does a corpse become excrement?
Land argues it's a matter of biological function and species utility. The corpse is defecated as waste by the life of the species, marking the biological individual's consummate superfluity. Life processes are characterized by the assimilation of useful matter and the rejection of useless matter. Once the body is dead, it is rejected by the overall system of life. It's waste product. It's expelled by the ongoing vitality of the species.
So we're born, we're alive, we're temporary biological scaffolding, and then when we die, we are officially rejected by the collective species and flushed out. A literal waste product. A cosmic turd.
That's one way to put it.
And the only sufficient appropriate academic response to this utter rejection is convulsions of horror that explode into peals of mirth.
Precisely. This laughter is uncompromising. It's an intellectual convulsion that transcends rational boundaries. Land calls it a communion with the dead. It is death itself that finds a voice when we laugh, a hemorrhaging of pragmatics into excitation and filth. It's an immediate solar expenditure of energy, a philosophical orgasm, if you will, that destroys the orderly boundaries of civilized discourse.
It also transcends the boundaries of decency, but hey, who's counting? Okay. Let's unpack the core economic concept that fuels this whole grim carnival, the solar economy. This is where the theory of squandering truly takes off, making the whole excrement theme cosmologically relevant.
The universe, according to Bataille, is fundamentally energetic, and its inherent fate is utter waste. It's a concept rooted in thermodynamics, where energy is constantly dissipated. The vast, immense energy discharged by the sun is unilateral. It's given away without reckoning, without counterpart. This unilateral expenditure forms the basis of the general economy.
So everything on Earth, including our miserable lives, is powered by this massive cosmic act of squandering. Land calls life itself a feverish obscenity.
Correct. Life is viewed as merely a pause on the energy path, as a precarious stabilization and complication of solar decay.
The general economy, unlike the restricted economy of human industry, views production, all our hard work, saving, accumulating, optimizing, as nothing more than an illusion.
An illusion? That's easy for a philosopher writing about obscenity to say, but my mortgage is pretty real. What does he mean production is an illusion?
Land calls it a hypostatization of a digression in consumption.
Oh, what now?
Meaning production only exists to temporarily slow down the process of dissipation. We accumulate resources, we build things, and we create systems of storage, but that energy was always destined for loss. We're simply taking a short detour on the road to total thermodynamic annihilation. Bataille famously said, "The world is sick with wealth." The primordial task for humanity, therefore, is not to survive or produce, but to radically consume this clogging floods of riches. Wait, hold on. Let me just pause and savor the internal conflict here. You're telling me that this book, which rails against accumulation and posits everything as waste,
Yes.
required the author to accumulate years of academic knowledge and expend massive amounts of human energy typing this garbage out at 3:30 a.m. This whole process was, by Land's own metrics, a feverish obscenity and an unforgivable waste of the sun's perfect squandering potential. I love the beautiful hypocrisy.
Well, the text itself anticipates that critique, Uncle Bob. Bland recognizes that the impulse is toward liquidation, toward releasing the energy unilaterally without reckoning. The goal is pure expenditure, not profitable accumulation.
So the ultimate cynicism is realizing that all terrestrial endeavor, including the writing of this very book, is just a massive waste of solar energy. And the only philosophical honesty is to just embrace that waste.
That embracing is the thirst for annihilation. It is negation torn from its logical function, decoupled from purpose, and attached to a motor of liquidation. It acknowledges the terrible materiality of this drive, a negativity that exists as a violent, unreasoning excitation.
So it's not just philosophical despair. It's cosmic justification for lighting your money, your home, and your career on fire just to feel something for once. Land even notes that this thirst is an ulceration in the gut, an aberration inextricable from truth.
Hmm.
So we're starting strong with a doctrine that equates profound, absolute truth with getting rid of everything, including yourself. Fantastic. It's an intellectual roadmap to moral anarchy.
And that profound truth, in this context, is that the system of life demands waste and dissolution, and that attempting to regulate this flow is the source of all neurosis and, well, all philosophical error.
The ultimate doom. All right, let's see who this doctrine blames for slowing down the party.
It's quite a list.
Moving on to Land's hit list. Because you can't be this profoundly anti-establishment without finding someone to blame for the current miserable state of affairs. Land makes it clear. Contempt for common evaluations is necessary, and you must actively avoid straying accidentally into the right. You must aim to be an alien, a beast.
This is the definition of libidinal materialism.
Right.
It's a philosophy that sees traditional philosophical discourse, polite propositions and linear arguments, as fundamentally repressive. It is less interested in truth claims than with creating punctures, actively hacking at the floodgates that protect civilization from a deluge of impersonal energy.
So it's not really a philosophy. It's an intellectual wrecking crew. That sounds like the credo of a punk-ass nerd who decided the best way to justify being rude and failing to file his taxes was to write a dense, jargon-filled book about it.
Whoa.
You can't just say, I hate everyone and I wear socks with sandals and refuse to participate. No, you have to invent libidinal materialism.
It is described as aggressive, enthusiastic for anegoic delirium, the dissolution of the ego, and, critically, massively irresponsible. It represents the textual return of that which is most intolerable to mankind, the chaotic, non-productive force.
Well, I find dense philosophical jargon intolerable, so I guess it succeeded on that front. Now, let's get to the genealogy of philosophy, because Land needs to place the blame for the system of repression. And he starts with the OG of repression, Immanuel Kant.
Land treats Kant's work not as a triumph, but as a major crisis point that Western thought never really recovered from. Land's critique centers on what he calls Kant's great, though unadmitted, discovery, that apodictic reason is incompatible with knowledge.
Wait, what exactly is apodictic reason, and why does Land claim Kant betrayed it? Can you break that down?
Of course. Apodictic reason refers to knowledge that is necessarily or demonstrably true certainty beyond any doubt. Kant's critical project famously showed that while reason strives for this universal necessary truth, the world of experience, of phenomena, can never fully deliver it. Therefore, Land argues that Kant exposed a void. The necessary truths of reason cannot fully grasp reality.
I see. So instead of admitting that reason is, completely useless, which is what a true nihilist would do, Kant retreated.
Exactly. Land calls this retreat the most elegant philosophical crime. Kant invented transcendental reasoning, the idea of knowledge existing outside or beyond the empirical world. Land immediately mocks this as the most elegant euphemism in the history of Western philosophy because transcendental means free of reality.
He's a cheese blockhead of epistemology who invented a new kind of jargon just to protect the establishment from the nihilism he just unleashed. This critique exposed all the truths of reason as big lies.
And those big lies created what Land calls a ghost landscape of metaphysics. This landscape, he claims, is crowded with divinities, souls, agents, perdurant subjectivities, and the Gothic confessional of guilt, responsibility, moral judgment, punishments, and rewards.
In short, the sprawling priestly apparatus of psychological manipulation.
Precisely.
So Kant's entire project was just a complicated bureaucratic scheme to keep the theological priesthood in business by giving them a new set of buzzwords, noumenon, categorical imperative, and so on, all designed to keep your focus off the pure, horrifying waste of the sun. It's intellectual vandalism of the highest order.
And when the dogmatic authority of the church crumbled, the ensuing intellectual disputes, the antinomies, led to generalized skepticism. Land views the skepticism not as a sign of intellectual health, but as a catalyst of dissolution, opening the door for critique that functions as a shockwave of obsolescence. Reality becomes soluble in the madness of invention.
Beautiful, pure intellectual destruction. And then came Schopenhauer, who didn't fix anything, but at least made the cosmic dread kind of exciting.
Schopenhauer took Kant's underlying concept of the will, and radically transformed it. He shifted it from the Kantian will, which is conscious, rational agency pursuing ends, toward a notion of increate matter. He recast the will as a pre-representational, blind impulse, an anarchic force that anticipates atheistic materialism.
He started shifting the focus from God's creation to anarchic, unlawful, increate matter, matter that literally evades essence and definition. That sounds promisingly destructive. But Land argues Schopenhauer was still a moral coward, didn't he?
He did. Land argues Schopenhauer still considered this pre-ontological cosmic bedrock morally objectionable. Schopenhauer replaced theism with an extrinsic moral principle, the denial of the will we should strive to negate this blind impulse. He failed, according to Land, to rigorously interrogate his moral heritage.
And why?
Because the institution required it.
Because if you're a philosophy professor, you've got bills to pay, and a denial of the will does not make for a successful tenure application. This is where Land gets really specific, criticizing the institutional nature of thought itself. He quotes this, listen to this. It never occurs to a professor of philosophy to examine a new system that appears to see whether it's true, but he at once tests it merely to see whether it can be brought into harmony with the doctrines of established religion, with government plans, and with the prevailing views of the times. After all this, he decides its fate.
That quote is a scathing indictment of the university system. It asserts that academic philosophy engages in a sordid flirtation with state power and essentially polices itself against ruinous ideas. The job of the academic philosopher is to be a gatekeeper of socially acceptable thought.
It's all just optimizing for tenure, avoiding controversy, and making sure the university budget is secure. That's why optimism, the idea that being is worthy of protection, is the general form of apology, slowing down any genuine revolt or critique. If you don't have a persuasive plan of the future, your negativity is delegitimated. That's why Land prefers pessimism, which is the first truly transcendental critique operating against being itself.
This line of radical anti-humanism flows directly into the modern era, where Land focuses a huge amount of critical firepower on Jacques Derrida. He sees him as the perfect modern example of intellectual domestication.
Derrida, the master of the anemic takedown. He took Nietzsche's revolutionary dynamite and turned it into a small, polite firecracker, right?
That's Land's argument. He argues that Nietzschean theology is constantly confused with Derrida's deconstruction. Derrida's approach is rooted in Heideggerian phenomenology, focusing on presencing, or Anwesenheit, the event through which a phenomenon is given. The core Derrida insight is that presencing has traditionally been conceived on the model of presence, leading to an interminable generative non-presence.
Okay, let's translate that for the listeners who haven't spent 3 weeks staring blankly at a page of German-influenced French philosophy. When we try to talk about something being here, presence, Derrida argues that the only reason we can conceptualize it is because we are simultaneously deferring or differing from its complete definition. He endlessly probes the border between presence and absence, which he calls difference.
Yes. Difference with an A signals both difference and deferral. It means the definition of any concept is always pushed back, always deferred, because the structure of language requires a constant play of absence and presence. Land argues that this resonance with Nietzsche is entirely superficial.
Superficial why? Because Derrida is still stuck in the phenomenological tradition with its fetish of awareness, asking polite questions about language. While Nietzsche was dealing with the energetic unconscious and massive cosmic annihilation, Derrida is playing with the rules, and Land wants to burn the rule book.
And Land skewers Derrida's style itself for having inherited a considerable dosage of Teutonic inelegance and obscurity. His deconstructive method, focusing on binary distinctions, becomes the systematic closure of the negative within a logico-structural sense.
So he takes the exhilarating negativity of Nietzsche, the idea of radical destruction, and bilaterally imprisons it within the concept. Every D on or dis is immediately turned into a docile mirror image of what it's destroying. It's safe, it's academic, it's perfect for tenure.
That is the core of Land's indictment. He directly criticizes Derrida for commensurating difference with the reality principle in his analysis of Freud. Land reads both as instances of the regulation of discharges. Derrida channels the descent of effective quanta, rerouting them into a detour, adapted to the exigency of repetition.
That's the money shot right there. He's saying Derrida takes the explosive, destructive urge, the libidinal discharge, the solar violence, and turns it into a neat little secondary process recycling program for the ego. The energy is managed, regulated, and put back to work in the machine.
This is why Land says Derrida reinforces the secondary process politics of psychoanalysis and produces one of the most coherent apologetics of libidinal vivisection, the surgical cutting up and domestication of desire, ever written, all wrapped in a spuriously subversive rhetoric.
Derrida is cast as the ultimate academic insider, the assimilator, obsessed with conceptual capture, thriving upon the frustration of rupture. He is likened to Hegel, the ultimate assimilator in the service of toothless academic professionalism. The strategy is fundamentally Kantian. If you want to protect Western metaphysics, you attack it with measured vigor yourself to preempt its real annihilation. That's why deconstruction is merely managed and reluctant change.
Land concludes that deconstruction rescues Western metaphysics from its own decrepit self-legitimations, reinforces its institutional reproduction, and ensures its teleological dignity. It's the intellectual equivalent of a controlled demolition where the building is replaced by an identical, slightly shinier one.
And this brings us to the final, savage, beautiful mic drop. When discussing phallic representation and zero, Land writes, socio-historically, phallus and castration might be serious enough, but cosmologically they merely distract from zero, staking out a meticulously constructed poverty and organizing its logical displacement. If deconstruction spent less time playing with its willy, maybe it could cross the line, you doofus.
It's an aggressive, though highly targeted condemnation of the psychoanalytic terminology he believes Derrida remains trapped within. Land argues that focusing on the phallus as a symbol of presence or power is still only a temporary metaphysical contrivance, diverting attention from the true, cosmic, annihilating zero.
It's savage precision. He's calling him a masturbating goofball who can't get his priorities straight because he's too busy managing the system instead of destroying it. That's the energy we came for. Now that we've established that all rational philosophy is a form of repression, we need to see what that repressed solar waste finally emerges as when it hits the body. And that leads us straight into the truly disturbing stuff.
If all production is repression, the repressed solar violence must emerge somewhere. This leads us to the metaphysical implications of horror and sexuality in Bataille's work. The Platonic sun is the source of illumination, truth, and goodness. Bataille's sun is the opposite.
Of course it is.
The dark and contagious sun, the black sun of spittle, which inflicts ruinous passion. He claims that the sun is nothing but death, waste, and virulence.
The ultimate light source is actually the ultimate drain. This leads directly to the core themes of Bataille's fiction, specifically the story of the eye, which he published under the pseudonym Lord Ock. The key imagery revolves around the eye, the traditional organ of vision and reason, being annihilated by solar truth.
The book culminates with a bizarre and disturbing sequence involving a priest, the heroine Simone, and an excised eyeball. Land details how the priest's excised eye, having been contaminated by the horror, is made to slip into Simone's vulva. The eye, which is meant to symbolize the clarity of vision, is obliterated, drinking it down into the nocturnal labyrinth of the flesh.
So the pineal eye, the organ meant to crown reason and look directly upon the heavens, and the truth, is instantaneously enucleated by the deluge of searing filth, which is the sun's truth. The ultimate expression of philosophical vision is having a priest's eye shoved into a vagina. This is the definitive work of a bicycle seat sniffer, who profoundly confuses gratuitous pornographic weirdness with profound systemic truth.
Land notes the inherent contradiction Bataille explores. The eye, symbol of the dazzling Platonic sun, is simultaneously imagined at the summit of my skull as a horrible volcano in eruption, with exactly the murky and comic character which attaches to the rear in its excretions. It is essentially a fecal eye vomiting the black sun of spittle.
A fecal eye vomiting a black sun of spittle. Just perfect. It's grotesque. But Land argues this is not just a sexual or scatological quirk. It's a profound atheological statement about the failure of transcendence, which brings us to the shocking claim about God.
Yes, this is where the atheology culminates. Land asserts, in the context of atheology and ontology, the study of being, that God has only one possible meaning: phallus. The God of the ontological argument is omniphilous.
Oh, the divine erection. I knew it. I knew theology was just repressed psychoanalysis in a funny hat. Explain the resulting philosophical bind for the omniphilous.
The premise is that if God is the ultimate being, the transcendent object, he must exist forever. Therefore, she establishes himself as the supreme transcendent object, the immortal organ of intimidation, and must eternally postpone the black spasm or detumescence.
The moment he climaxes, he ceases to be the supreme transcendent object. Is that it?
Exactly. Detumescence would lead to the dissipation of the principle of identity, causing being itself to relapse into the dark. God is permanently erect out of sheer existential terror of zero, terrifying the cosmos into submission.
I knew it. The Judeo-Christian God is just a classic sketch of pathological insecurity. Unable to even dream of escaping the smell of oneself, constantly repressing the inevitable flop. Land notes this phallus is equivalent to castration. To be immortal is to abstain forever from the destructive flow. This is a brilliant, though utterly cynical, theological psychoanalysis.
It is a sophisticated way of claiming that the entire Western theological tradition is founded on the repression of the molten penis of terrestrial coupling, which would dissolve logic and order into vulvic dissolution. The transcendent God is the ultimate expression of the restricted economy saving and accumulating energy by refusing the ultimate expenditure.
Magnificent. Now, let's see what this general economy looks like in practice, outside the confines of the phallic god and the excised eye. We turn to the ultimate historical example of squandering the Aztecs.
Bataille uses the Aztecs as a prime example of a society operating at the measure of the sun, realizing the truth of the solar economy on Earth. They engaged in massive, organized violence and sacrifice, not for conquest, but as necessary consumption to ensure the sun would continue to blaze. They realized the truth of the sun upon the Earth through carnage without purpose.
Heart-ripping as macroeconomic policy. Tell the listener the specific, gruesome ritual detail the source provides, because this is where the theory hits the concrete.
The priests would kill victims atop pyramids, often prisoners of war, stabbing them in the chest with obsidian knives and tearing out the still-beating hearts, which were then lifted up to the sun. Land argues this practice was not political or religious manipulation, but the recognition that the sun itself is the expression of sacrifice.
And Land argues this senseless slaughter represents the unavowable source of social impetus. This pure, immediate expenditure, this ritualistic waste, is the core engine of culture, operating outside the rational, restricted economy.
Land suggests the raw energy that drove Aztec ferocities is the same molten terrain that drives Bataille's relentless atheological research, but our modern accumulative culture has regulated that energy, turning expenditure into productive consumption. Like shopping for groceries or buying a book on Bataille. The Aztecs, by contrast, understood that expenditure should be an uninhibited wastage that immediately returns energy to its solar trajectory.
So our banking system is just a much slower, less glamorous form of heart sacrifice. I prefer the Aztecs' direct approach. Now, let's introduce a historical figure who embodied this annihilatory impulse perfectly, taking the concepts of consumption and waste to their most terrifying, localized conclusion. Gilles de Rais.
Gilles de Rais, famously a companion of Joan of Arc, inherited an immense fortune. He rapidly liquidated this fortune through what the source calls abnormal extravagance. Following his financial ruin, he subsequently murdered numerous children, mostly males averaging 11 years old. The estimated figure at his trial was up to 200.
The source material is quite specific, detailing the horror, emphasizing that Rais's interest was less sexual enjoyment than the vision of death at work, cutting throats, detaching limbs, loving the sight of blood. Land argues that Bataille frames this crime as involuting the social excess, the immense fortune Rais squandered into a secret terminus within his fortress, the solar anus, or black sun.
Bataille views Rais's crimes as tragic, an involuted form of consumption. When the noble class could no longer squander their wealth through legitimate military conflict, that massive social excess had to go somewhere. It retreated into secret, terrible acts, demonstrating a hidden and unholy participation in the annihilating veracity that Land calls the solar anus.
Look, land. You cannot philosophize pure, heinous, evil child murder and call it economic intimacy and expect to be taken seriously as anything other than a moral numbskull. The source material tries to position this atrocity as a form of inutile criminality, useless criminality, one of the incendiary and epidemic gashes which contravene the interests of mankind.
And that is precisely Land's point, Uncle Bob. The analysis insists that the crime is transcendent. Rais's crimes are those of the world in which they are committed, and they represent a violence without measure that cannot be safely assimilated by sociological analysis. The truth of transgression for Land is that evil does not survive to be judged.
Because death has no representatives. The point is that the atrocity itself, the solar barbarism, is the reality, and law is merely the pathetic, after-the-fact, juridical attempt to catch up. I'm starting to think this entire philosophy is just an elaborate, highly intellectualized coping mechanism for people who realize society is built on unmanageable, terrifying violence. And they just want to give that violence a cool geometric name like the solar anus.
That is the ultimate conclusion. The repression necessary to maintain the restricted economy makes such eruptions not just possible, but inevitable.
Okay, having successfully located the solar anus, let's switch gears and look at the capitalist system, which, according to this philosophy, is the ultimate attempt to repress all that necessary solar wastage.
Capitalism is the projection of the most extreme possible refusal of expenditure. Land fully accepts Max Weber's thesis that Protestantism critiqued Catholic, excess lavish cathedral building, indulgences, massive public festivals, precisely because the church functioned as an economic drain. The Reformation was the cultural precondition for the modern economy closing upon itself.
It replaced aristocratic extravagance and religious waste with rational reproductive consumption. It's the ultimate ascetic movement. Land connects this directly to Marx. The cult of money has its asceticism, its self-denial, its self-sacrifice economy and frugality, contempt for mundane, temporal, and fleeting pleasures, the chase after the eternal treasure.
Bourgeois society is, therefore, the first civilization to totally exclude expenditure in principle, focusing only on productive reinvestment. But if production cannot escape the cosmic demand for dissipation, this leads inevitably to chronic overproduction crisis.
The machine keeps making more stuff because it can't want itself to waste anything, and eventually the system clogs up and collapses under its own weight. The bourgeois dream is infinitely more boring than annihilation. They are terrified of waste.
Capitalism systematically repudiates overproduction as a problem, leading to chronic crises that can only be momentarily deferred, often through quasi-Keynesian solutions nucleated on massive government spending, historically focused on U.S. armaments.
Capitalism uses production to hold the solar violence prisoner. This takes us directly back to the concept of the libidinal war machine. If production is repression, then war, in its purest form, is the necessary non-productive release.
Nietzsche is invoked. Great politics is a war of the spirit that aims to blast all power edifices resting on a lie. He advocates, you should love peace as a means to new wars. This is the libidinal comprehension of peace as a unilateral differentiation from war. War, on its intensive cosmic axis, is a metamorphosis of forces toward tactical fragments and dissolution, a goalless polemos of Heraclitan in flux.
Land is explicitly stating that war is not an instrument of policy in the Clausewitzian sense.
Oh.
Clausewitz defined war as the continuation of policy by other means. War, in its radical Bataillean sense, is not an instrument of any kind. War is desire itself, convulsive recurrence, unilateral zero. It's the free flow of solar violence, imbued with sacred characteristics, which production industry holds prisoner.
War, therefore, is not a political evil, but evil itself, the necessary annihilating force. Land argues that every reckless debauching of humanity's productive resources has a military character, anarchic violence, senseless prodigality, contestation. Sades, orgies, criminality, and war all share this military principle, leading to the collapse of centralized pacification.
And this leads to Land's final, cynical punchline about political resistance to fascism. The thought that there might be a political response to fascism makes me laugh. Shall we set our little fascism against their big one? Organize ourselves, become disciplined, maybe we could make ourselves some smart uniforms and stomp about in the street? Politics is the last great sentimental indulgence of mankind, and it has never achieved anything except a deepened idiocy, more work, more oppression, more pompous assholes demanding obedience.
Land argues that politics is the ultimate theological construct, endlessly asking, who has the power? But revolution must be abandonment, a washing away of monotheism and statecraft. The goal isn't political reform, it's burning a hole through the wall of civilization to allow the flow of the general economy to resume.
Let's burn the wall with some abstract geometry. We need to introduce the closing, most abstract concepts. The labyrinth, the sponge, and zero. Because what is this chaos if not geometrically defined?
If the world of reason is built on firm ground, what happens when that ground is dissolved? Land introduces the concept of sponge space, referencing the Menger sponge. This is a fascinating fractal structure, a perfect cube where the center one-third of every face and the center cube itself are removed infinitely. It is a structure of inexhaustible porosity.
Wait, if you keep removing the volume, you end up with a porous structure that has infinite surface area but zero volume.
Precisely. It's an uncircumscribable intrication. The difference between transcendence, firm ground, defined limits, and immanence, flow, flux, dissolves. Reason, Land says, is rotted to bits in sponge space because its reliance on clear boundaries and distinctions is pulverized by porosity.
The traditional philosophical structure of things gives way to porosity. Everything flows, nothing holds its shape. And atheism is this structure.
Land suggests that atheism is ultimately this immense sponge, a mega sponge, the dissolution of boundaries and all of its positive complexity. It's saturated with negation, pregnant with lethalities, and drunk upon the sea.
The ultimate fate, the return of impetus, the chaotic flow, is eternal recurrence, which Land describes as the abortion of transcendence. It is the constant intensifying return of inhuman squandering, the cyclical nature of energy dissipation.
Recurrence is not a repetition of the same identity, which is what Nietzsche's concept is often misinterpreted as. Instead, it is the consistency of difference with equalization. The sole philosophical rigor of recurrence is the pulverizing inundation of bilateral distinctions by indifferent matter. The system keeps running, but the purpose is always dissolution.
And the unavoidable consequence of all this analysis, the final conclusion for the human mind is, for any ardent materialism, truth is madness. The human impulse to separate, to be autonomous, to define oneself, is annihilated by the reality of matter, which is malignantly metamorphic, infectious, gnawed and rotten with time. If you truly accept this, you lose your mind.
Finally, we reach the conclusion regarding love and death, tying back the sexual and sacrificial themes. Love is not a gentle emotion, but a thirst for disaster, an ultimate illness and crime, driven by a longing for the unrestrained debauching of the means to live.
Erotic passion has no tolerance for health or bare survival. A love that doesn't lead to ruin is philosophically disappointing. The true intimacy is not fusion, but the lip of fusion, where one betrays life, where one feels the plenitude of horror and joy coincide.
Bataille writes, "My rage to love opens onto death as a window onto a courtyard, because death is the only place we profoundly touch each other outside the restricted economy. Communication is opened by death alone, and the very act of writing this text," Land concludes, "is a holocaust of words, an act of failure and abortion, because theory cannot survive the truth of annihilation."
The text itself is a meticulous facilitation of chance and failure, running strategy into chaos, a screen provoked by what becomes its own meaninglessness. This book is not meant to be understood. It is meant to be suffered. We just suffered through it for you.
We did.
All right, we made it. We survived the theological phallus, the economics of ritual heart-ripping, the intellectual mega-sponge that eats reason, and the self-condemnation of the author writing at 3:30 a.m. Land's The Thirst for Annihilation is an utterly successful yet unreadable holocaust of words. We've confirmed that this book, which rails against accumulation and rationality, is a vast, complicated accumulation of jargon designed to justify why its author is a miserable, rude genius.
We've seen how Land, channeling Bataille and Nietzsche, systematically attacks every edifice of rational reproductive consumption. Kantian reason, Derridian regulation of desire in global capitalism. The core message remains consistent. Everything is temporary, everything is waste, and the cosmos demands utter, spectacular expenditure without purpose.
Everything is a failure, including the attempt to explain failure in a book. The philosophy is a glorious failure, and that in itself is beautiful, according to the very tenets we just painstakingly dismantled.
But here is the final provocative thought to leave you with, straight from the source's core cynicism about society. Land suggests that the good is exactly what we don't want. The problem with goodness is that it's depressingly tedious. We are all gnawed by unbehagen, that persistent human discontent, and secretly long for disaster, because disaster is where the true solar expenditure finally occurs.
So if goodness is so boring and we all secretly want disaster just to feel alive, what ridiculous rational good thing are you sacrificing right now? What productive resource are you squandering just to get that little hit of annihilation, that small, invigorating rush of pure, magnificent waste? Maybe you're spending hours listening to a podcast about philosophical nonsense instead of organizing your filing cabinet. Maybe you're drinking 3 extra cups of coffee, accelerating your own energetic discharge. Embrace the glorious, sticky black sun.
Or perhaps you're simply facilitating the failure of the restricted economy by choosing entertainment over accumulation.
Exactly. We're facilitating your spectacular collapse. Now buzz off, you silly goose, and go waste some time. We'll see you next time on Books I Will Never Read Again.